What's up, everybody? This is Kevin.
This is Ryan.
And this is Becca.
And you're listening to the Generation STEM podcast.
The one and only STEM podcast.
For young professionals.
By young professionals.
Join in on our free-flowing conversations.
Where we break down all things STEM.
In an easy, fun, and digestible way.
We are
Generation STEM.
Welcome, everybody, to the very first episode of the brand new but also still old podcast, the Generation STEM podcast, or if you're cool and want to abbreviate it, the Gen STEM podcast, formerly known as the Close of Business podcast.
Moving forward, as kind of like an initial push for our new brand, Generation STEM, which we're really excited about. We're going to be doing COVID-focused kind of topics like this, loosely focused COVID topics over the next few weeks. So continue to tune in. Hopefully we'll be getting you guys an episode a week to help cure your quarantine boredom.
Yeah. And we know you've got nothing better to do, so y'all better watch.
You better rate, you better review, you better screenshot it and post it on your social media and sit and listen to every episode of us because you know you love it.
Cough on you. On today's episode, we thought we'd do a little interesting discussion on innovation that occurs during times of crisis and turmoil. Obviously, all this brought on by the recent COVID-19 pandemic. And, you know, Ryan actually introduced the topic to us as we were just kind of brainstorming, and he thought it'd be a good idea just to talk about, because I didn't realize it. Ryan found out that, you know, a lot of great companies were born during times of turmoil and crisis. Existing companies that embrace the process of innovation also took over during these times. They might have been smaller and now they're giants. And this episode, we're just kind of going to discuss the philosophy behind that and give some examples of some turmoil in the U.S. history and companies that have thrived.
Let's do a quick around the horn quarantine update. You know, we've been in quarantine for 5.5 weeks now. How are you guys feeling? And, you know, how's the past week or two been?
Well, I found a mouse in my basement last week, so that was a nice little surprise.
Stuart Little!
Yeah.
A little house
Stuart.
Right?
Yeah, so... you know, quarantine's going well. I'm not having the human interaction, but I'm having some little critter interaction. So, you know, it's a nice little surprise.
Yeah.
We resorted to, instead of being able to go to bars and whatnot this weekend, we just decided to make our own little fun drinking location on the rooftop of a parking garage at the apartment complex this weekend. So that's what we've resorted to, you guys.
Oh, that's cool.
One-on-one BP, you know what I'm saying?
Oh, very nice. I guess my update is, other than like severe depression from the thought of sports being canceled, I'm learning to cook pretty dope pizzas. We cooked a mushroom.
That's amore.
It's amore. Yeah, I'm essentially Italian, but we cooked a really dope. What's the really truffle oil mushroom pizza, and then a chicken bacon Alfredo pizza. So.
Ooh. Are you doing St. Louis style or New York style?
Flatbread, just
thin crust
flatbread pizza. Yeah,
we're making it a healthy twist. We're all about
Actually, big news. Kinsey is going back to St. Louis for her niece's first birthday on Wednesday. She's driving there for a parade where you drive by the house with balloons.
Oh yeah.
So she's going back Wednesday, and rumor has it she's going to pick up St. Louis's. So Emo's is the famous thin crust pizza, but Cecil Whitaker's is the low key. It's incredible. So she's going to pick up some Cecil Whitaker's pizza and drive it back to Kansas City for dinner Wednesday. So that's huge.
That's love.
That's big.
That's love.
That is love.
All right. Well, now that we've gotten everyone updated on what our quarantine lives are looking like, apparently the highlight of them are finding new pet mice and making pizzas. Actually, we made pizza last night too. Shoot! But great minds think alike. That's amore. But getting into the topic for today, as Kevin mentioned, we wanted to focus on a topic that was kind of inspired by the unprecedented times we're seeing right now. Obviously, a lot of the impact that we're seeing from COVID-19 has been health related, but I think one of the longer term effects that we're going to be seeing from this is economic difficulty. If you're like the three of us listening in, you've been watching the stock market every day, placing your bets. It's got to make up for all the other types of gambling that we can't do right now. So we're very focused on kind of like where the economy is going, and it's a big point of attention for us. So that inspired the main topic today that Brian. Wow,
yeah,
Brian.
New co-host.
New co-host Brian.
I'm rebranding my name.
We rebranded the podcast, and Ryan is rebranding himself as Brian.
It's Brian with a Y.
Ryan brought forward this interesting article that he had read a couple years before that talked about how some of the most successful startups and businesses in American history have been founded during times of economic turndown and recessions. So that's something we wanted to talk about today. First off is kind of talking about like the overall philosophy on how these businesses are actually teed up to be successful versus, what the opposite assumption would be, that they would just spiral and go into bankruptcy along with a lot of the other major businesses that are pre-existing, similarly to what we're seeing now and in other previous recessions. And doing a little bit of research on this, I read a lot of articles by economists and people like that kind of talked about like why startups founded in recessions are actually more likely to be successful. Ultimately, it's that organizations could pinpoint things, intangible or not, that people need in order to adjust and thrive to a difficult time.
If you kind of think about it, it kind of forces entrepreneurs to take that leap of faith. When people unfortunately are let go, they don't have another option. And so they may have been holding on to an idea for a while. And a lot of great companies are founded off of, taking a risk.
Yeah, it's like the true entrepreneurs step forward, and like the ones who like have the grit to take the chance are the ones who are going to like hustle hard enough and figure out how to be agile enough to make their businesses successful. Because in a lot of cases, like they don't have any other option. Right. And a lot of what I read was talking about like the less abundance of venture capital. I think like we've seen, especially over the past, like since the .com burst, we've seen so much coming out of Silicon Valley and all of the startup air and everything like that. And there's always been an abundance of venture capital. But in a lot of cases, and this is like something that was really clear to me when I was reading about this subject, is that just because there's a lot of liquidity in financing and there's a lot of venture capital available doesn't necessarily mean those businesses are like teed up to be successful, right? It's kind of like Ryan mentioned, like people who don't have the venture capital and have to like lean on their own financing and just have less abundance are going to have more grit and like buckle down and be more agile to make their company successful because they just don't have any other option.
Do more with less is kind of the theme of that. And also too, if you're getting funding from a venture capitalist, they obviously have their own motives, I guess, to become financially, to return on their investment. And so sometimes entrepreneurs' vision of what their company wants to be may change because they have other stakeholders at play. So those were kind of some of the factors. And also too, they talked about different things like there's more talent available, which is kind of what we mentioned before about you making the personal decision, but then also building your team. And just, if you're able to weather the storm, you'll come out on the other end, in a better situation. But also one thing that I would touch on as well is a lot of large companies in crises, there's so much, we say red tape a lot on this podcast, but there's a whole lot of moving parts, so they can move a lot slower, where if you're an agile small company, you can kind of be a lot more agile and flexible and kind of adapt to current problems.
Totally.
Yeah. In some ways, like a crisis or being in some type of an economic downturn almost is the best environment for innovation. And that like the entire purpose of innovation is to like find a answer to a problem, to find a solution. And in a crisis like COVID-19, you find the spotlight being put on that problem. Finding a problem or really coming down to the root of a problem is like one of the hardest things when it comes to innovation. Like, there's an issue, you just don't know what the exact issue is that you need to solve. When these types of crises kind of put the spotlight on the root cause of the problems. So it makes it easier to find that and then in turn develop a solution. And I found a really cool article that kind of describes like 4 aspects of a crisis from Larry Clark in Harvard Business. It's called Innovation in a Time of Crisis. And he outlines like 4 aspects of a crisis being uniting around a purpose. So you get an organization that is like united around finding a solution to this one problem. Similar to, he cites the Apollo 13 explosion and like all the NASA engineers trying to find a way to scrub the air so that the astronauts can arrive safely back on Earth.
Putting the round peg in a square hole or whatever they have in the Apollo 13 movie.
Exactly.
Innovation at its best.
So like, Becca, you mentioned on the last episode, like some alcohol companies are like completely switching from distilling alcohol to helping create hand sanitizer, and that has become the purpose. Like that entire company or that entire brewery has united behind that one purpose.
Or like manufacturing companies making ventilation systems for hospitals and things like that. Ventilators. That's the word I'm looking for.
It's giving you your reason why, and if you do any reading, the why is like one of the bigger parts of finding a solution. And then the second part is you're able to see the vulnerabilities. You're seeing the system in a different light. The spotlight of a crisis is different than just the day-to-day whirlwind of things. The third is it kind of like cuts the red tape that you might find in bureaucracy. Like, for example, the example he gives is like grocery stores. Their process of stocking certain goods and items is based on maximizing profits. But when this happens, your whole inventory and your supply chain goes out the window because now you need to supply people with the goods that they need.
Right.
It's no longer the most profitable. So now you're able to bust open that set of processes and rules that you had, completely reevaluate the system as a whole and redesign it. And in turn, you can find inefficiencies in your supply chain or the way that you're stocking items. And then the last would be a crisis demands action. I think especially as engineers or scientists or people in the STEM field, we love like finding the perfect solution, inventing the perfect product. Whereas in a crisis or a downturn, you need action. You can't just sit at the drawing table because something has to be done. In the case of COVID-19, lives are going to be lost, people are going to be quarantined, and the economy is going to continue to crash unless we find a solution. So it demands action rather than just the continual designing. So
right.
Yeah.
I think
thought that was a good article.
Yeah, totally. I think there are a lot of things while, we're talking about startups and new businesses and stuff in particular. I think there are a lot of themes of this that are super applicable to like, I don't know about you guys, but what I'm doing day to day at work in engineering in the power industry, right? Like recessions and unprecedented times like this kind of force people to think creatively because they're new procedural constraints that we have to work around. And so it's just forcing us to think how we can do things differently than we do before. So like, I feel like now I'm thinking more creatively on how I can execute my work from home.
So I think it was mentioned like in the beginning of this, before we got into like the philosophy of everything, that some of the larger companies were founded from economic downturn or times of turmoil and crises. And I just want to like quickly list off some of these companies. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go through kind of a timeline of each crisis or economic downturn. And we only have so much time, so we handpicked a few and give examples of companies that were innovative during these periods. So first of all, I thought this was really cool. GE was created in 1873. It was called the Panic of 1873, in which GE grew out of. Disney was founded during the recession in 23 and 24. HP was founded during the Great Depression, Hewlett-Packard during the Great Depression, and Microsoft during the 1975 recession. So those are some of the larger companies in the world right now, and they were all founded in times of crisis and turmoil. So first two that I'm going to be covering, first two times of turmoil and crisis are going to be the Great Depression and then leading into World War II, and how these crazy times and the inventions they led to in the companies that were innovative during those times. So the first would be the Great Depression. It has nothing to do with anything, but Monopoly came out of the Great Depression. Didn't know that. Just guy looking for a board game from his neighbors and like trying to have fun. And there was this board game that his neighbors were playing, so he kind of developed it, and that's kind of cool.
And he's like, nobody in America can afford food or housing, but they sure can buy board games.
Well, yeah,
it works. It's still around today.
Yeah.
I thought, and this kind of leads into an interesting quote I heard, is that even during the Great Depression, it's not that consumers stopped spending money, it's that they started spending their money more purposefully, and that companies that recognized that were the ones who succeeded. A great example of this is Kellogg versus CW Post. I guess two huge cereal brands now. It used to be like they were hand in hand. CW Post even had the edge before the Great Depression. But when the Great Depression hit, CW Post cut budgets, stopped funding, and just really kind of did what you would think a typical company would do. You know, if you're in an economic crisis, well, it stops spending money because the future is uncertain. Meanwhile, Kellogg, they recognize that, you know, these consumers are going to keep spending money. We just got to get them on our board. And while not necessarily relating to STEM, they pumped a ton of money into advertising and a ton of money into like research and I guess a little research and development of food to develop this cheaper breakfast item called cereal. Another really cool company, so I mentioned HP was developed during the economic downturn. And I guess HP started out two Stanford, MIT, super smart guys, graduates, engineers, who were uncertain about the job market at the time they were graduating. I think it was like in 31 or around 34, and they were losing jobs and stuff like that. And finally, they just decided that, hey, we're going to take our knowledge and start developing our own product called an audio oscillator. And, you know, meanwhile, I was reading the timeline. This guy would get a job, and then these two would work on it. Then they would get a job, and this guy would like quit or get fired and come back and work on the product. So they were trying to hold jobs to fund it, but couldn't. And finally, they went to a convention and were able to sell a few. And then Disney heard of them and gave them a huge order, which really kind of gave them their bust. But Ryan, you mentioned earlier that like a lot of times the big push is just you're fired. You're forced to leave that comfort zone, and you're forced to take that leap of faith into entrepreneurship. And that's almost exactly what happened with HP. Another company, DuPont, during the Great Depression, and this kind of leads up into World War II. They had more and more money into and continue feeding money into their R&D and innovations departments where other companies weren't.
What was DuPont originally? Because, I mean, it's like a chemicals company, essentially. Is that what they started as?
I think so, because the article I read is that during this Great Depression, they came up with a synthetic rubber, which was like a cheaper and more durable rubber that could be used in all different neoprene. It could be used in all different kinds of applications. And then that kind of leads into World War II, where I found a lot of like the really cool innovations were developed around World War II. Obviously, a war of that magnitude created a lot of problems that needed to be solved. Mm-hmm. One of those was synthetic rubber and synthetic oils. Obviously, all the machinery of war requires oil and rubber for the tires and tanks and treads and stuff like that. And I think, you know, in the United States, the Axis had control of a ton of oil fields. So we had to develop synthetic oil to help fuel our vehicles over there. Rubber was expensive and not as durable. So we developed synthetic rubber. I don't know if it's the exact one that DuPont, I think it's a different one than what DuPont developed, but the synthetic rubber for tires is more durable and cheaper. Penicillin is probably the biggest discovery / invention during this time. Even though penicillin was discovered in the 1920s, it wasn't fully manufactured until 1940s because of the war. I think the first time they were able to successfully use it on a human or find enough penicillin to work on a human was 1941. And then it was brought over to America to learn how to mass produce it because of World War II. Interesting fact, bacteria infections is like one of the leading causes of deaths in wars up to that point. They had an 18 to 20% death rate. And
that makes
with the
sense.
It does. I mean, you get shot, you're not necessarily dead, but the infection that comes from that is like what.
Right.
So penicillin was able to bring that down to 1%, and they were able to mass produce up to 650 billion units in I think like 3 years, from like going from saving one person and then 4 years later being able to produce 650 billion units. That's obviously brought on because of World War II and the need for it.
That's insane.
And then just real quick, pressurized cabins. Originally flying in an aircraft, especially during wars, like unpressurized and severely cold, and it led to like hypoxia and other issues in pilots. And they had pressurized masks that they would wear, but they're super bulky and they couldn't really fix an aircraft if it were to get damaged or anything. So the invention of pressurized cabins was used for World War II aircraft, and then that led to the commercial flight boom in the 1950s. Is when you start. I
was gonna say, when did people start flying commercially? And I don't know why I thought it was before that, but it makes sense that would only be able to take place once they were able to. Because it's not like they had commercial size planes flying and everybody had an air mask.
Right. Actually, like the first commercial flight was like 1912 or something. And it was just a mayor riding on a plane from St. Petersburg to Orlando or something in Florida. And then like Ford had a series of planes that they would create, and they would be like 12 seaters. And this was before World War II, but they were still unpressurized, and you're talking 12 seats. Whereas after World War II, you had larger planes and pressurized cabins to where people were like, hey, this actually isn't terrible to fly on a plane. And that's where you saw that boom. The U.S. Post Office that started like the first revolution of commercial flights, and that's only for delivery of goods. And that was pre-World War II.
Interesting.
But again, that's not people and not what we think. It wasn't until after World War II that we're doing what we think.
Yeah, totally.
So yeah, some great examples there of innovations that occurred during the Great Depression and World War II.
Dang.
Well, kind of hop off of that. Mine was, we're going to fast forward about 80 years.
Nothing happened.
Nothing happened. No innovation. But we decided to touch on 9/11 and kind of how that terrible event and the crisis brought about innovation. And this is a little more tech related. You know, Kevin's was manufacturing and industrial, but this is a little more kind of stepping into the new tech of today. And I thought it was really interesting doing some of this research. Is that I was third grade. I think you two were, Kevin, you were third. Becca was second.
In second grade.
Second, yeah.
Mrs. Moon's second grade class. I remember it.
Yep. And so like we experienced the situation, but we didn't really know some of the problems. You know, we kind of talked about how these crises showed certain needs or certain problems with the ways the society is set up, and how these new startups fulfill that need, or new technology fulfill that need. And so what I found fascinating in this kind of research was what kind of were those needs, and what has that led to. So obviously one of the things was need for better security. And so we all know about TSA and kind of what that has caused. But there was a really big push just from a security standpoint. And so the government funded a lot of this. And one of the big things that they funded was facial recognition. So, you know, in airports, all these computers determine, you know, abnormal patterns in facial expressions. And I kind of did some research in a rabbit hole about how that has transpired. Computers are able to recognize facial patterns or verbal patterns and try to tell if someone's lying or not. And so that was kind of something that's been kind of further developed. So, yeah, so that was one of the things. But then facial, you know, they had all this data. And so data mining is a really big and broad term. For anyone who doesn't know, data mining is essentially making use of all the data you're collecting and creating an output that can be digestible and can be used. So like artificial intelligence relies a lot on data mining. But how data mining plays into 9/11 was they were wanting to gather all this real-time intelligence to try to maximize the security of an airport or just of society. And so they had to take all these real-time inputs about how people are maybe acting in an airport, chats on the web or whatever it may be, but analyzing that and reacting to it in a quick manner. So there's a lot of investment there, and that obviously has spurred the whole data mining has spurred into all technology that we use today.
So a lot of the innovations that you're talking about were developed post 9/11 as a means to like preemptively try to shut down acts of terrorism or acts of, okay.
One of the other things that I didn't really realize was building up the web that we know today in wireless communication. So one of the big problems during 9/11 was a lot of the first responders couldn't respond with each other. And so that was one of the big problems because there just wasn't the broadband essentially to communicate. And so one of the big pushes post 9/11 was the expansion of the mobile communications network. So, there's a lot more instant communication. And one of the articles that I actually read brought up an interesting point. They didn't say that it was a direct tie to 9/11, but they said that the event of 9/11, they believe from a psychological standpoint, kind of spurred social media as we know today. Because pre 9/11, there wasn't a whole lot of, use the web to search Google articles or different research. It wasn't meant to communicate remotely. But, Facebook really spurred out of post 9/11 because people were wanting to interact more on a day-to-day setting. There is more of a concern for how others are doing and interest for how others are doing. And then kind of the last two things I wanted to bring up. One is drones. So there is a big emphasis on drone research and just unmanned aircrafts in general. One of the articles I read was about trying to develop if you could control a plane remotely. So, if a terrorist got in the cockpit, you could override their controls and fly the plane. But also just drones from a military standpoint and a war standpoint that developed it a lot. So all you IG drone flyers out there. There you go.
Making your drone videos for Instagram likes.
Exactly. Same lines of that. iRobot. So, we're talking unmanned technology. iRobot, which I use every day for my Roomba. That was actually developed and largely funded post 9/11 because they were wanting, again, it started out as military applications, but they wanted practical unmanned robots, and that kind of obviously served its function in the military aspect, but then went over to the consumer side of things.
So what I ended up looking into was prior to COVID-19, the most recent economic downturn that we had, which was the Great Recession. So that took place, it started in December 2007 and went through June 2009. I remember my mom was like temporarily laid off from work, and that was like the main indicator of like why I remembered that period of time. But that was a pretty common thing that a lot of people across the United States are seeing. But the Great Recession was linked to the subprime mortgage crisis. So it was essentially a housing market bubble that burst. A little bit more information on that. So like prior to that time, the housing market was growing so rapidly. Like the value of houses were growing at a really rapid rate. And a lot of lenders and banks were starting to give loans to people with poor credit, just trying to take advantage of the really fast growing housing market.
Kevin's cat Benner could have got a loan, I think.
Kevin's cat Benner could have gotten a loan. Literally, it was like this housing boom happened. The mortgage lenders were trying to capitalize on it, and so they just like approved everybody. Like, you get a house, everybody gets a house. Like everybody got houses at this point of time prior to the market crash. So after the market ended up crashing, a bunch of the lenders went bankrupt there because the people they were lending to couldn't afford to make their payments. And then not only that, the total value of the houses that they ended up providing mortgages for declined to below the previous value of the home. So essentially, they couldn't recoup the funds that they were lending. So a lot of lenders and banks went bankrupt. There were no buyers for the houses that they foreclosed on, and so it just put them in a real big pickle. And interestingly, I found this interesting that prior to this this market collapse, the stock market reached an all-time high in October 2007. And I read that and I was like, that sounds pretty familiar because that's what happened last year, right before the COVID-19 outbreak. And now we're seeing a market crash. So I just thought that was like kind of an interesting connection to draw. Again, during this time, a lot of startups were created. Everything post.com burst was really focused on tech startups in Silicon Valley and innovations of that sort. So that's a lot of what I saw as well. During this time, a lot of the startups were driven by kind of a handful of things. First, some startups took advantage of affordable real estate. Real estate was at an all-time low for the 2000s, really. And so one of them in particular, Smashburger, shout out Smashburger, ended up taking advantage of the low real estate value and were able to get locations that were a lot more feasible for their business to survive. And it was also locations that they wouldn't have been able to afford prior to a real estate market crash. Also, Forbes 2014 100 Most Promising Businesses list. I found this interesting as well. Over 1/3 of that list were founded in the Great Recession. I found that very, very interesting. And overall, during this time, since a lot of people were laid off from their typical jobs, there was less of a dilution of talent, like Ryan mentioned before. So the really talented people ended up congregating in less companies. And as we know, simple thing about successful businesses, better people, better success in business. And then also just true entrepreneurs with true grit showed themselves. Less venture capital floating around during this time, especially in Silicon Valley prior to earlier in the 2000s. So it was people who were just buckling down, financing the companies themselves and making do with what they could. Some of the big tech companies that everyone has heard about that was founded during this time period, Uber, WhatsApp, and then a couple that were pretty directly related to what was going on in the United States economy at the time. First, I found interesting was Groupon. It was a company that really focused on kind of the difficulty that consumers were having during this time period and capitalizing it. So they were providing performance-based marketing solutions and connecting businesses that were still operating but were really needing business, and then connected them with customers by providing them discounts. So it was connecting businesses who needed consumers to come in, and it was providing consumers discounted rates that they wouldn't be able to afford otherwise at this time because everyone was really struggling financially. So I thought that was like a pretty cool example. Also, Airbnb, directly related to kind of what the housing market was like at the time. Prior to the real estate market collapse, real estate was just through the roof. And the guys who founded Airbnb were located in San Francisco, kind of the epicenter of real estate inflation, really struggling to pay rent during this time. And they said, you know what, we're going to put an air mattress on the floor of our apartment to make up for the unrealistic real estate market so we can pay rent. And I thought that was a pretty cool example of like how they ended up developing a solution during a trying time. So, and then
another one that Becca, I'd throw in there that I thought was interesting, that I feel like controls my days before quarantine, when I actually had social interaction, but was Venmo. So that was another one that I saw.
Yeah,
and
totally.
Kind of the whole fintech movement that kind of was created by the collapse of a lot of these banks doing all these transactions by technology means, not in person. That was another one that came out of that I thought was interesting.
Yeah, totally.
So we kind of discussed a lot of the innovations in history throughout like crises in history and stuff, but I think we wanted to end the meat of today's episode with just talking about COVID-19 and what we think like some of the innovations that are ongoing or some things that could happen as a result of COVID-19 are. For sure. And I guess I'll take the easiest one for me. The most glaring issue, in my opinion, is obviously in the medical field. Mm-hmm. And maybe it's not an issue, but I think it's definitely something that I've always had beef with, and I think we can enhance the process. And that's like going to see the doctor and just going to the doctor's office or like getting a checkup in general. I think it's
Right.
ridiculous that we have to like go in person just to get, your, especially at a young age, to get your heart rate and everything, just to be told you're super healthy.
Yeah, I know what you mean. And I'm going to brag a little bit, Kevin, because when we did that decade in review, that was one of my predictions for the 2020s was the adoption of telehealth. And so I know exactly what you mean. I mean, I even KU Med, I got an email a couple of days ago that telehealth, they already set that up for KU Med patients. And like, I think it's going to stick around because, I mean, we've talked about how annoying it is go into an office. One, you're around all these sick people and you may not be sick. You may just be there for a checkup.
That's what I mean, yeah.
And two, just the waste of time and money and resources. I second you on that one.
I think in general, like also because the testing process of this has been such a pain, and a lot of people will blame the testing issue that we've had in the United States as something that has actually kind of like fostered the growth of people contracting COVID in the United States, right? I think that maybe this could lead to people creating innovations in at-home testing services. I don't want to bring up the whole Theranos scandal again. Again, if you guys haven't watched that HBO documentary, you totally should. It's so good. But like the whole concept of it is being able to very easily access health testing, which is something that like we can't do right now based on our healthcare system. So I think that we're going to see some major innovations over the next few years just based on testing alone.
One of the issues with the testing isn't just like, oh, we're not administering enough tests. It's like the test that we can't administer is up the nose, but by the time you get tested for up here, it could have already moved into the back of your throat, or if it's not in the back of your throat, it could have already moved into your red blood cells. So then you need like 6 different, very intricate blood tests to confirm or deny. So it's not like, oh, we're not able to supply enough tests. It's like, the tests that are standard that you see aren't necessarily the test. Like you can be like, yeah, you're good. You don't have COVID because we swabbed the back of your
or they swabbed one nostril and like it might only be present in the other one or something.
Yeah, exactly. It's like it's just an inefficient test, and the ones that are efficient are like extremely detailed and blood tests. And I think that's kind of what Theranos, I don't remember what you mentioned. You mentioned that like a couple episodes ago. I think that's kind of like the at-home blood testing kit, right?
Yeah, it's not necessarily at home at this point, but it's supposed to be like you can go to a Walgreens pharmacy, book an appointment online, and then they just prick your finger and fill up like a capsule-sized sample of blood, and then run essentially every single medical test there is, but also an alignment kind of like what you're looking for and what your health history is like and things like that. I don't know. I think that it's going to be one of the major drivers. It's going to be a huge innovation, in my opinion, in the medical industry.
Mine's kind of like yours, Kevin. I mean, I started thinking about this when I was researching 9/11, obviously, and the result of that crisis and disaster was TSA and security, not only in airports, but also security at sporting events, going through metal detectors or being swiped down. And one of the things that I've heard, and the more I think about it, the more it could be a possibility, is same screening but for sickness and large events. So I've seen they're talking about how they can scan their body temperature through whatever infrared, I believe it is. And so that's a way to detect that. But then also too, like I didn't realize until I had my shoulder surgery this past December was like the technology they use to get your temperature in the hospital is they just like put this wand over your forehead, and that like within 5 seconds got my temperature. And so it's like it could be something like, instead of going through a metal detector, maybe you go through both, which would be, I mean, whatever your thoughts are on it. But
what a time. That's just a crazy thing to think about.
So you're saying it'd be a crime to walk around while you're sick?
I mean, that's before 9/11, people didn't think it was a crime to like carry around a pocket knife, and that obviously has changed. I mean, I think certain drastic situations change people's liberties, and we'll see what happens. I mean, you can make your own opinion on the morality of it or not, but I mean, that's what I've heard, at least as a real possibility.
I'd love to revisit this topic in like 5 years. So like the basis of this conversation, no, I'm serious. The basis of this conversation is, okay, there are all these companies and innovations that were developed during times of economic and humanitarian strife, right? It would be so interesting to like go back and evaluate some of these predictions and kind of get an idea of like, okay, what companies actually did end up surfacing related to like the innovations we're talking about that ended up like thriving in this economically deficient time.
And how many of the founders were listening to this podcast when they got their idea?
If so, you're welcome. Give us free 5% stake in your company.
Yeah, we just need some money. That's it. So on a I guess less serious note from like scanning and like all that, I think another industry that I honestly believe that this, you can book it right now, 100% will change is education. The whole online class thing is going to be
for sure. There is some computer like scientist in his basement quarantined right now, just going at it, coding up the next big technology in remote education, like bets. Where is that guy? Step forward, identify yourself so that, again, I can invest in you.
I will say to that, the tough part will be there's probably going to have to be an age range because 10-year-old Kevin's probably not going to be able to have the discipline to sit down and learn. But I mean, like college education, that's something that totally can be implemented.
And that's what I'm talking about.
Oh, I was talking about elementary kids. Shoot.
Oh, I was talking about like college.
Think about if there were like strong tools right now because every single like K through 12, every kid is home. I just think that even there are going to be big technologies that come out of this. I don't want to speculate, but like I feel like this could happen again, or there could be a trend towards remote schooling. I don't know.
Just with that though, I mean, a lot of parents, I mean, do rely on school as almost a babysitting place, and also I mean, I'm serious.
No, totally.
But also, I think like when you're younger, that's when you need the social interaction and social development. That as a young age, I think is still important. So
totally.
I mean, do you lose?
I'm not saying we should do that. Oh my God, I'm the product of a public school here, public schools. K through 12, product of that. Big fan of kids going to school and socially interacting. But I'm just saying, who knows what the future has to hold. Going off, talking about like the younger generation and education, something I was thinking about is kind of how all of this is going to impact the future of the STEM industry. If I'm a kid, who's interested in math and science at this time, I could potentially see this pandemic as, something that inspires me on a future career path in the biomedical or medical space, because, like I said, seeing a huge pandemic like this could be a calling for a lot of kids. So I'll be really interested to see kind of like what the trends are in terms of STEM recruiting and kids entering STEM programs in college over the next, 5 to 10 years as a result of all of this.
I think, and I've got more that I think is there's going to be innovations in the way we grocery shop now too. Like,
oh, for sure.
And just like the supply chain of, I mentioned earlier on the podcast, how the food gets to the store, but how food is now going to be delivered to people's homes. Like we kind of saw that before, like in 2019, it kind of, getting your groceries delivered with Amazon Pantry or whatever the name is. But I think now, like, people are kind of being forced to use these, like, I download the Hy-Vee app and I'm buying groceries on an app and then picking it up at a grocery store or having it delivered to my house rather than going in. Not only is it a time saver, but now I'm not interacting with all those people, right?
Mm-hmm. It's like forced adoption of something they've been trying to get us to do for a couple years.
Exactly. Yeah. And then I think 3D printing.
3D printing for sure was like on my list of things that this is absolutely going to fuel the development of 3D printing. Man,
tell us more
I'm just thinking in general, how nice would it have been if everybody had tiny little 3D printers right next to their toilet that would just print out 3 toilet paper squares every time they went to the bathroom. We wouldn't be fighting people in grocery stores and drugstores and paying $50 per roll for toilet paper had this been taken care of earlier. So this is my call to action for 3D printing developers and scientists. Let's get to it. I want my 3D printed toilet paper.
Yeah. That or like the respirators or the little respirator mechanism on the N95 masks.
Absolutely.
Can make those, and
both from like a medical equipment application and also just from like necessary goods. This has made everybody kind of reflect on like what their needs are day to day and taking them for granted. And I think that like 3D printing would be the perfect outlet to ensure that we don't ever have a shortage of necessary things such as medical PPE for medical professionals ever again. You know,
it's a little less STEM related, but along those same lines, I read an article and it's really interesting. They were explaining the pointer theory that post-COVID, people are going to live with less. Like the quarantine has shown you that you don't need as much as you initially thought you needed, I guess, when it comes to material goods.
I agree. But then there are people who are also like, I went buck wild online shopping, so maybe I just...
Yeah, what do you mean live with less? If anything, I'm buying more to keep me happy.
Well, it was kind of the whole, like, do you really need a car as much as you think you need a car? Do you need to go out to eat as much when you've gotten used to cooking at home? Like, the way that you operate on a day-to-day may change.
I will be interested to see kind of moving forward what the trends are in terms of work. I know we touched on future of work in a previous episode, but it'll be interesting to see whether or not companies start to decentralize their workforce and have people working remotely. While it has been a challenge, I think the companies who have been able to adapt from their professionals working at home and kind of getting them, you know, moving along business as usual is proof that potentially they'll want more people just working from home.
Yeah. So those are some real life applications that probably have some theory behind them. What we're going to do next, and we don't know if it'll have theory or not behind it, but we're going to, we said we're going to come up with an idea or an invention or development of technology that COVID-19 and quarantine has made us want to be here ASAP. So I'm going to go with my first one. You know, I had a tough time thinking of one that would be unique, but I'm ready for holograms to be here.
I have that on my list too.
I understand the value of videography, or Zoom and, you know, all that stuff, but my specific application was board games, which is crazy. But I've mentioned before how quarantine has really gotten me into board games. But the problem is, like, you lose that appeal of a board game, even if it's over like a electronic, like I played Ticket to Ride on my app, you know, I bought that, but like there's no human interaction, you know, unless I call them and just talk to them constantly on the phone. It's just totally different. So I'm ready for a hologrammed Monopoly board, and a little hologram Kevin to be across from me.
My curiosity is what are the capabilities of the hologram? Like, what all can it do?
Well, I'll start with baby steps. So, I mean, a hologram square, and so that's meant for board games. So you could do any square board game. So that could be Scrabble, it could be a Monopoly.
Oh.
It could be I don't know, Ticket to Ride, even though that's not a square.
It was too good of an idea. Stop.
Sorry.
TM,
bro. Because the one thing, like, okay, so, you know, you play Zoom. I think one thing that's really cool is if you haven't downloaded Jackbox TV, it's kind of like, Ryan, what you're talking about. It's like a digital video game.
Quiplash? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, like Quiplash.
Yeah.
It's like a digital video game that you don't necessarily have to be in the same place, because right now it's like board games, you have to physically be there. Card games, if you're, you know, playing like a drinking game or something, you know, you got to show the laptop of there, and then everybody still can't interact with the same deck of cards.
Right.
Like if they want to play, it has to be a different deck, or if you want to play virtual beer pong or something, they've got to have their own cups. But yeah, if you could do something where, Ryan, you've got it set up at your house, I've got something similar in my house, but we can interact on the same board. You move, it shows that move on my.
Exactly. That's what I want. So please, someone.
Okay.
Maybe that's an app. I don't. Maybe we just invented another app, and this is like a really dumb idea.
Possibilities are endless here. That could, like Ryan said, starting with baby steps, and that could just evolve. Next thing you know, you can play
I want
real life.
cards. Like, I don't know. Just give me something.
All right.
I'm gonna go next.
Go ahead.
I'm gonna hijack it. I said disinfecting doorway vortexes. Like
you just throw complicated at it, or
no, but you know exactly what I mean. Like, you walk through, like, you can install it inside the doorway of your own door. You open it, and you walk through. It's a freaking vortex of disinfecting spray that sprays you and just cleans you off.
Car wash.
Yes. Well, I mean, okay, Ryan, let's not get it twisted. This does not mean that we have something that replaces showers. People must still shower.
Oh, dang. Okay.
They will just be disinfected.
What if the second level is Febreze though? So you're disinfected and you smell good. That's essentially a shower.
So maybe we can't replace it.
Oh, I don't know. I'm gonna have to look into that.
Save the water problem of the world today. Becca, you just saved it. There you go.
Wow. Congrats, Becca. Congrats.
Thank you.
So mine, two quick ones. I think maybe I'll start with a quick one. I'm sorry, like I can't choose between the one because they're both kind of mediocre. But LED masks. So like rave boys and looks walk around with like the face masks that are LED and light up, but like because of COVID-19.
But it's like a disinfecting LED mask.
Something like that. Like you could walk around and like it would change. Well, one, it's just like, hey, masks might be a future thing that we have to wear because of this.
I'm just saying that this is like bringing the masks are making the rave trend more mainstream. So
we lived for this day. We lived for this day.
This day.
It's like a mood. It's like a mood ring for your face. It does a smiley face or like a
Yeah. Or like if you're breathing and it shows that you're sick, like it's red if you have COVID, it's blue if you have the flu. Like, so people are like, get away from me. I don't know. So that was a dumb idea. So my real idea is, all right, what like a sensor or like somehow on your phone, if you could kind of like a telehealth app, but it would be constantly monitoring, or maybe it's just like a sensor you wear, but it would constantly be monitoring the air. And let's say like you're at a bar and you hear some dude coughing, and then all of a sudden
you're like, "Hey Siri, dude, is that guy sick?"
Well, yeah, you get like a buzz. You get like a buzz and be like, alert, like
drinking.
COVID-19 or something, like, because it's particle based. Like it could test the air and it could tell you like, "Hey, get out of this bar. This dude has COVID and he's coughing everywhere."
Honestly, I kind of like that idea because have you guys noticed just in general in society over the past like 2 months? If you were, and I hate to be this person, but like, if you hear somebody do something as little as sniffle, you're automatically, you're alienating them, you're judging them, you're discriminating. You're like, that person is sick and I need to get away. Even if that person might just have allergies, right? That would kind of like get rid of the inherent discrimination that we've had against people who have the sniffles.
I was in the grocery store and I like had just a cough and like I was trying my hardest just to hold it in because I was like, I don't want to let this out and have everyone just look at me like, what is this guy doing here trying to get everyone sick?
I was literally at one point like a same exact story. Like I was like choking myself, like like trying to physically hold it in the store, choking myself because I don't want to cough. But yeah. Have you guys seen the animated movie Big Hero 6?
Mm-mm.
You should watch it. It's actually a really amazing animated movie. But the whole concept of it is that one of the characters in the movie develops in his like graduate school science lab, he develops a robot buddy, like medical buddy, that is with you at all times and will constantly monitor like whether or not you're sick, what your temperature is, like that type of thing. But it's in like this really cool looking like Michelin man type suit.
Yeah,
it's a great movie, highly recommend. But kind of the same,
music.
kind of the same idea, just a little more fanciful.
All right. So if you're a new listener, we typically give 3 and rank them in our gold, silver, and bronze. But since we were lacking time, we each gave 1, and we would like you to kind of give us feedback on who you think's idea is the best. I don't know if it's the best or the most likely to. I would have to say
up to interpretation.
Up to interpretation. If we had to rank ourselves right now, I'm gonna have to go Ryan, Becca, then me. Gold, silver, bronze.
What? A freaking disinfecting vortex? Are you kidding me?
I like the idea.
You literally just said that I was solving the water problem on the planet, and you're not giving me the gold. What is wrong with you?
I do like the thought of the replacing showers with Becca's idea. That's think about all the time you could save.
I love showers, so I don't. That also makes me sound like an ignorant first world person.
Yeah, but you take showers because you need to take showers. What if that need can be fixed by something else?
It's an experiment I'm willing to toy with, I suppose. I'm open.
Hey, Ryan,
don't knock it till you try it, I always say.
Quit being humble, Ryan. You won. Okay, we get it. You're humble. Accept your gold medal, Becca.
I'll start off
do better next time. Yeah. At least you're not me. Anyways, I guess that's all we have for you, Becca, Ryan.
Appreciate it, and hopefully, you guys enjoy what you hear and give us feedback.
All right.
See you guys.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for listening today, you guys. For more Generation STEM episodes, find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere you listen to podcasts. Find us on social media at Generation STEM or send us an email at generationstem@gmail.com.